300,000 men were trapped. The German army was certain it was the end of Britain's war. But as bombs fell on the beaches of Dunkirk, German soldiers noticed something terrifying. The British were not running. They were waiting. On the dawn of May 28, 1940, German infantrymen of the 56th Infantry Division lay pressed against shattered trucks and shell-cratered roads outside the coastal town of Bray-sur-Mer, just west of Dunkirk. Before them stretched a sight that made no tactical sense. More than 200,000 British and Allied soldiers were pinned against the sea. Their backs were to the channel. German guns dominated the beaches. Dive bombers from Sturzkampfgeschwader 1 screamed down from the clouds, tearing holes in sand and steel alike. By every rule of warfare, the enemy force should have collapsed. Yet it did not. Through binoculars fogged with salt and smoke, German soldiers watched long, orderly files of men standing chest-deep in icy water. They waited silently. No panic, no rush. Hours passed under constant bombing, and still the lines held. Small civilian craft moved back and forth between the shore and the larger ships offshore, like ants feeding a colony. When Stukas dove in, the men bent low. When the explosions ended, they straightened, reformed their lines, and continued waiting. A lieutenant from Infantry Regiment 192 wrote that evening that the scene was deeply unsettling. The enemy, he noted, behaved not like men facing destruction, but like commuters delayed by bad weather. He admitted it disturbed him more than any resistance he had seen in Poland or France. To the German rank and file, this was not how the British were supposed to act. For years, Nazi propaganda had painted Britain as a nation in decline, comfortable, soft, unwilling to endure hardship. The soldiers on those beaches contradicted every leaflet, every radio broadcast, every political lecture they had heard. This moment marked the beginning of a quiet mystery within the Wehrmacht. The British soldier, as encountered in reality, did not match the caricature. He did not fight with dramatic gestures or ideological fury. Instead, he displayed something far more difficult to break: discipline without display, endurance without noise. The German army's first sustained contact with British ground forces had come only days earlier, during the rapid collapse of the Low Countries. The speed of the campaign shocked Europe. Armored spearheads of Panzergruppe Kleist punched through the Ardennes, crossed the Meuse, and reached the Channel in less than 2 weeks. The Allied northern armies were trapped. German planners expected surrender on a massive scale. Instead, they encountered stubborn, delaying actions. At St. Omer, Watten, and the fortified port of Gravelines, British units fought methodically, withdrawing only when ordered, destroying bridges behind them, and buying time at a terrible cost. Later, General Erich Hübner, commander of 17th Panzer Corps, would remark that British rearguard formations withdrew like professionals, not fugitives. Units such as the Royal Northshire Regiment and the East Lancashire Battalion held crossroads and canal lines far longer than German intelligence had predicted. These actions made possible what followed on the beaches. At the time, German soldiers could not yet know the full meaning of what they were witnessing. They only knew that the enemy they had been taught to underestimate was behaving in a way that demanded respect and raised uncomfortable questions. The evacuation was not yet complete. The war was far from over. But for many Germans watching the Channel that week, something fundamental had already changed. These formations understood their fate. They were not fighting to survive. They were fighting to buy time. At the fortified harbor of Port Saint-Pierre, Colonel Arthur Mallory received a final directive from London. The message was brief and unmistakable. The position was to be held at all costs. There would be no second evacuation, no relief force, no retreat. Mallory commanded barely 3,000 exhausted men, a mixture of regular infantry, engineers, and logistics troops armed with little more than rifles and outdated anti-tank guns. Against them advanced elements of the 8th Panzer Division, supported by artillery and close air support. For 3.5 days, the defenders held. German after-action reports later described the resistance as irrationally determined. British troops fought from barricaded warehouses, from cellars, from upper floors reduced to rubble. When ammunition ran low, they redistributed it by hand. When officers were killed, sergeants took command without hesitation. A junior German officer wrote to his wife that the town became a stone trap, where every street corner had to be taken twice. He admitted that the timetable collapsed completely. What was expected to fall in hours required days. When Colonel Mallory finally ordered the surrender on May 27th, his force was effectively destroyed. Fewer than 50 uninjured men were taken prisoner. The rest were wounded, dead, or missing. But the delay had achieved its purpose. Each hour the port held was an hour gained elsewhere. Similar scenes unfolded across the shrinking perimeter. Near Villers-en-Caux, British armored units launched a sudden counterstroke against advancing German columns. The force was small, fewer than 60 tanks, many of them lightly armored, but the attack struck with such precision that German commanders temporarily believed they were facing the vanguard of a larger offensive. The assault was led by elements of the 1st Armored Brigade, acting on their own initiative. At the time, General Karl Hoth, commanding a panzer corps in the sector, recorded that communications briefly broke down under the pressure. Anti-tank guns were hastily repositioned. Infantry was ordered to dig in. For several hours, the German advance halted completely. Later assessments would show the British attack lacked the strength to exploit its success. But its psychological effect far outweighed its material impact. German commanders had assumed that encircled forces would conserve strength, seek escape, or surrender. Instead, the British attacked. This unexpected behavior planted doubt. If an army surrounded, outnumbered, and cut off from supply could still launch counterblows, what else might it attempt? This question weighed heavily in the days that followed. When the order arrived from Berlin instructing armored formations to pause and consolidate, few officers openly objected. The official reasoning cited terrain concerns and logistical strain. Unofficially, many commanders admitted a deeper unease. They had learned, painfully, that the British did not behave as expected. Meanwhile, along the coast, the evacuation gathered momentum. Between May 27 and June 5th, a vast and improvised maritime effort unfolded. Naval destroyers, fishing trawlers, river ferries, pleasure boats, anything that could float, crossed the narrow waters repeatedly under air attack. German observers watched with disbelief. One artillery captain wrote that it felt as if the sea itself had turned against us. Despite relentless bombing, the flow of men continued. Columns marched onto the beaches in order, waited, embarked, and disappeared into smoke and mist. From a purely operational standpoint, the Germans had won. The Allied armies had been driven from the continent. France stood on the brink of collapse. The carefully constructed image of the British as pampered and fragile collapsed completely once the fighting became prolonged. The men who had escaped across the Channel were not broken. They had absorbed defeat and adapted. To German soldiers, this was deeply unsettling. The environment where this reassessment became unmistakable was the North African desert. From early 1941, German forces under General Friedrich von Thalen, later joined by the more famous Afrika Korps commander, found themselves locked in a prolonged struggle against the British Middle East forces, later reorganized into the 8th Army. What began as a limited expedition soon turned into a grinding 2-year contest of endurance, mobility, and morale. German officers left behind unusually frank evaluations of their enemy. Private letters and field journals describe British troops not as reckless or weak, but as methodical and unyielding. One senior German staff officer noted that British infantry possessed an almost stubborn refusal to collapse, even when their tactical situation was clearly unfavorable. The Household Brigade, encountered repeatedly along fortified positions, attracted particular attention. German reports described these units as exceptionally disciplined, capable of absorbing punishment far beyond what intelligence estimates predicted. Their weakness, according to German assessments, lay not in courage, but in flexibility. Once committed, they tended to hold ground regardless of whether circumstances had changed. In contrast, the armored formations of the 7th Mobile Division, nicknamed by the British themselves the Desert Rats, were viewed very differently. German tank commanders acknowledged that these troops understood desert warfare instinctively. They maneuvered aggressively, concealed movement with terrain and dust, and showed little fear of direct engagement. Several German officers wrote that facing the Desert Rats felt dangerous but honest. They knew the British would fight, and that they would do so competently. Yet the most frequent criticism found in German writings did not target British soldiers at all, but their leadership. A recurring phrase appears across multiple diaries: brave troops, hesitant command. German officers believed British units were often committed piecemeal, ordered to hold exposed positions too long, or withdrawn just as success became possible. This inconsistency puzzled German planners, who recognized the fighting quality of the troops but questioned how it was employed. One intelligence analyst attached to the Africa Corps remarked that British soldiers would endure extreme hardship without complaint, only to be sacrificed by overly cautious or rigid planning. He found this wasteful and unnecessary. Nowhere did this contradiction become clearer than at the port fortress of Al-Marsa. For over 8 months, Allied forces, including British, Australian, Indian, and Polish contingents, clung to the isolated harbor under constant attack. German propaganda mocked the defenders as trapped and desperate. The defenders embraced the insult and turned it into an identity. German assault troops experienced something very different from what the headlines promised. An infantry captain wrote that every attempt to penetrate the perimeter felt like pushing against iron teeth. Even after weeks of bombardment, the defenders reappeared in trenches and firing points as if untouched. Night raids disrupted German positions. Supply convoys were harassed. Morale inside the fortress remained inexplicably high. From a doctrinal standpoint, the garrison should not have survived. It was isolated, undersupplied, and numerically inferior. Instead, it became a drain on German strength and logistics. Without control of the port, German supply lines stretched hundreds of miles through hostile desert, vulnerable to air attack and breakdown. By 1942, British commanders had become increasingly aware that their enemy's reputation could be as dangerous as his divisions. General Harold Alexander, overseeing Allied forces in the Middle East, circulated a confidential memorandum, warning officers not to exaggerate the abilities of the German commander opposing them. He cautioned that constant references to the enemy's genius risked undermining confidence among British troops. He insisted that the opposing general was neither supernatural nor infallible, merely a competent professional benefiting from favorable circumstances. The order was revealing. Armies do not issue directives against myths unless those myths have already taken root. The Germans, for their part, held their own commander in near reverence. To many Africa Corps soldiers, he was the embodiment of battlefield leadership, visible, decisive, personally present under fire. His image sustained morale even as supplies dwindled and casualties mounted. That image would be tested brutally in the autumn of 1942. At the Alamein line, the British assembled a force unlike anything the Desert War had yet seen. Massive stockpiles of fuel and ammunition were accumulated in secrecy. Infantry divisions were reinforced. Armor was concentrated. Above all, artillery was gathered in unprecedented density. When the attack opened on the night of October 24th, German soldiers described the barrage as overwhelming beyond description. Veterans recalled that the horizon appeared to burn continuously. Dugouts collapsed. Communications were severed. Units lost cohesion within minutes. Unlike earlier engagements, this assault did not rely on maneuver alone. It was systematic, relentless, and backed by total air dominance. German counterattacks were identified and shattered before they could gather momentum. The commander, whose presence had so often stabilized the front, returned from medical leave to find the situation already beyond recovery. Requests to withdraw were denied from Berlin. Orders arrived demanding endurance rather than maneuver. The result was annihilation by attrition. By the time permission to retreat was finally granted, entire formations had ceased to exist as effective units. Survivors later spoke of Alamein not as a defeat of skill, but of inevitability. No bravery, they said, could compensate for the disparity in numbers, fuel, aircraft, and guns. The long withdrawal across Libya and into Tunisia confirmed what many already knew. The Desert War was lost. Yet even in defeat, German soldiers noted a change in their enemy. British operations had become precise, coordinated, and uncompromising. One veteran remarked that the British finally fought without hesitation and without restraint. Respect replaced condescension, but the clearest expression of what Germans truly thought about British soldiers emerged far from the battlefield, in conversations never meant to survive the war. From 1942 onward, British intelligence developed a quiet operation designed not to interrogate prisoners, but to listen to them. Senior German officers captured in North Africa and later in Europe were housed in carefully prepared country estates on the outskirts of London. The most significant of these facilities was Marston Hall, a former aristocratic residence surrounded by gardens and high walls. The prisoners lived comfortably. They dined well. They exercised freely. They were encouraged to believe they were guests rather than captives. A courteous British officer, presenting himself as a retired landowner with aristocratic connections, oversaw their welfare. He spoke fluent German, shared wine, and subtly encouraged conversation. The prisoners, flattered and disarmed, obliged. What they never suspected was that every room had been transformed into a listening chamber. The value of these recorded conversations lay precisely in their intimacy. They were not speeches for subordinates or memoranda for headquarters. They were unguarded exchanges between men who believed history would never hear them. What emerged from these discussions was not contempt nor admiration alone, but something far more telling: reassessment. Captured senior officers repeatedly described British troops as reliable and technically competent. They emphasized caution rather than recklessness. Several noted that British attacks were rarely improvised. When they came with preparation, firepower, and clear objectives. This was interpreted not as cowardice, but as a deliberate effort to limit losses. One general remarked that British formations behaved like engineers solving a problem, slowly, methodically, but persistently. Once momentum was achieved, they rarely abandoned it. Defensive fighting drew even stronger praise. German officers agreed that British troops, once established in prepared positions, were exceptionally difficult to dislodge. Artillery coordination was cited repeatedly as a strength. British gunners, they said, understood timing, concentration, and counter-battery fire better than expected. But beyond tactical observations, the recordings revealed something deeper: surprise at endurance. Again and again, German officers admitted that they had assumed Britain would negotiate after France collapsed. Fighting alone against a continental power appeared irrational through a German strategic lens. That Britain instead reorganized, expanded its forces, and returned to the offensive contradicted their expectations. Certain units stood out in these private conversations. Elite infantry regiments were mentioned often, but so were irregular forces. Long-range patrol groups operating deep behind Axis lines were a source of irritation far out of proportion to their size. One general described these formations as persistent and unnerving, noting that they forced German units to divert manpower to rear area security. Small unit raids, sabotage operations, and intelligence gathering created the impression of an enemy that refused to remain passive. Perhaps the most striking theme in the recordings was confusion over motivation. German officers struggled to explain why British soldiers continued to fight for what they believed was a declining empire. Several theories were proposed: national pride, institutional discipline, cultural stubbornness. None fully satisfied them. One senior prisoner admitted that before 1941, many within the German officer corps assumed Britain might eventually align with Germany against the Soviet Union. They viewed Britain as culturally familiar, militarily respectable, and potentially pragmatic. Britain's refusal to make peace and its decision to cooperate with Moscow was perceived not merely as strategic opposition, but as ideological rejection. This realization unsettled them. The transcripts, amounting to hundreds of thousands of pages, remained sealed long after the war. When historians finally examined them, they found something rare: opinions unfiltered by hindsight, propaganda, or self-justification. They revealed how German perceptions of Britain evolved from dismissal to irritation to respect. Yet even these candid conversations did not fully capture the emotional impact of one specific aspect of British warfare. For that, one must look not at armies, but at raiders. Only weeks after evacuation from France, Britain initiated a series of small, highly publicized attacks against occupied territory. These early operations were militarily insignificant. A few installations damaged, some prisoners taken. Often, nothing achieved at all. But psychologically, they landed with disproportionate force. The fury provoked by these raids was not merely strategic, it was psychological. For the German leadership, the existence of British raiders operating at will behind supposedly secure lines represented a direct challenge to authority and control. The image of an impregnable fortress Europe was being undermined by a handful of determined men. Across occupied territory, German garrisons were ordered to raise alert levels. Checkpoints multiplied. Night patrols became routine. Entire battalions were reassigned from frontline duty to guard airfields, ports, bridges, and fuel depots. Resources meant for offensive operations were quietly drained away. The raids themselves evolved rapidly. Early operations had been crude, sometimes reckless. Losses were high. But with each attempt, British planners refined their methods. They studied tides, moonlight, German reaction times, and patterns of coastal defense. Surprise became doctrine. Violence became concentrated. Withdrawal became immediate. What mattered was not holding ground, but disappearing. German officers noted this shift with growing unease. Reports describe attackers who struck suddenly, caused maximum disruption, and vanished before any organized response could be mounted. The inability to bring these forces to battle was deeply frustrating for a military culture built around decisive engagement. Nowhere was this frustration greater than in North Africa. Small, mobile British units began to exploit the vastness of the desert itself. While German formations depended on roads, fuel convoys, and fixed airfields, British raiders treated the desert as open terrain. They moved at night, navigated by stars, and relied on improvisation rather than supply chains. One such formation became particularly notorious. Operating in dispersed teams, these raiders targeted German air power directly. Aircraft destroyed on the ground were far cheaper to eliminate than those engaged in combat. Each explosion represented not only material loss, but trained pilots and maintenance crews rendered useless. German commanders struggled to adapt. Increased guards merely provided more targets. Hardened defenses slowed movement. As pressure mounted, rear areas became as dangerous as the front. The response from German high command was predictable: escalation. Special hunter units were raised, trained specifically to track and destroy British raiders. These troops were well equipped, disciplined, and motivated. Yet they faced an enemy that refused to behave conventionally. Engagements were rare. Success was elusive. The desert favored those who understood it. Even when individual British leaders were captured, the operations continued. Command structures were deliberately flexible. No single figure was indispensable. Tactics were shared, refined, and passed on. Losses were absorbed. Momentum was maintained. German soldiers wrote bitterly of fighting an enemy they could not pin down. A recurring complaint in reports was uncertainty. Airfields felt unsafe. Supply routes felt exposed. Night offered no relief. The constant possibility of attack eroded morale far beyond the actual damage inflicted. The long-range patrol units deepened this sense of vulnerability. Using heavily modified vehicles, British reconnaissance teams pushed hundreds of miles beyond the front lines. Their primary mission was information, mapping routes, identifying supply depots, observing troop movements. But when opportunity arose, they struck. To German commanders, these patrols were infuriating. They did not seek combat, yet they shaped it. Information gathered by a handful of men could determine the outcome of a major engagement days later. Attempts to eliminate them rarely succeeded. The terrain was too vast, the patrols too elusive. The emergence of long-range desert patrols represented a form of warfare the German army had never truly prepared for. These units were conceived not by staff officers, but by men who understood geography as a weapon. The architect of this concept was Major Edward Hargreaves, a former civilian explorer whose pre-war expeditions had mapped regions of the Sahara that did not appear on most military charts. He understood something German planners did not. In the desert, distance itself could be camouflage. His patrols crossed areas Axis forces considered unnavigable. They traveled without roads, without landmarks, relying on celestial navigation and an intimate understanding of terrain. To German commanders trained in conventional operational thinking, such movement bordered on fantasy. The patrols became the eyes of the British command. They reported convoy movements, airfield locations, fuel depots, and defensive layouts with a precision that transformed operational planning. Battles were no longer fought blindly. British commanders increasingly knew where the enemy was and where he was not. These patrols also enabled something new: the projection of violence far behind the front. Raiding forces were delivered deep into Axis-controlled territory, struck and extracted without ever engaging the main German line. The patrols earned a wry nickname among British troops, but among German officers they inspired something closer to obsession. Repeated attempts to intercept them failed. Aircraft searched endlessly over empty terrain. Motorized columns exhausted themselves chasing mirages. The desert swallowed the pursuers and concealed the pursued. A German battalion commander wrote bitterly that these raiders left no footprints, no trails, only wreckage. He compared them to apparitions, visible only in their consequences. By 1942, the cumulative effect of these operations reached its peak. A series of increasingly audacious coastal raids demonstrated that even heavily defended installations were vulnerable. One operation eliminated a critical naval facility in western France through an act of calculated sacrifice, rendering it unusable for the remainder of the war. German naval officers described the blow as strategically humiliating. But the same year also delivered a sobering lesson. A large-scale assault on a fortified port ended in catastrophe. Allied troops were pinned down and destroyed by prepared defenses. Losses were severe. From a purely tactical perspective, the Germans had won decisively. Yet even in this victory, German leadership drew a conclusion that unsettled them. Documents recovered from the battlefield revealed a level of preparation, analysis, and intent that contradicted earlier assumptions. The Allies were not improvising blindly. They were experimenting, learning, and absorbing failure. What followed was not relief, but fury. Within weeks, an order was issued from the highest authority. It declared that captured raiders were no longer to be treated as prisoners of war. They were to be eliminated without exception. Uniforms, surrender, circumstance. None mattered. This directive was not a battlefield expedient. It was ideological, and it crossed a line that even some German officers recognized immediately. Reactions within the German army were divided. Some commanders implemented the order zealously, others quietly ignored it. A few refused outright, insisting that captured enemies be treated according to international law. The result was chaos. Survival depended not on actions, but on the identity of the captor. The British became aware of the policy. Training adapted accordingly. Raiders were instructed to conceal their affiliation if capture appeared imminent. Identification was removed, stories rehearsed. Sometimes it saved lives, often it did not.